So I'm in the redesigned Oudolf borders at Wisley. This is their first year, and they replace what was a long-term Oudolf planting, which surrounded just basically like a runway of grass running straight up this hill with even depth borders the whole way down. What we've got now is something so much more what you expect from Oudolf, and that is winding paths all the way down through this new planting. And the result is something so much more intimate and so much more immersive in so many ways. You get up close and personal with these plants in a way that you didn't. And this is the great genius, really, of naturalistic planting, is that you are no longer just an observer of these plants. You are a participant in their surrounds and in their nature. And this is quite new. You know, traditional herbaceous borders, you were standing on a lawn and you were held back and you were looking at this planting as a viewer, not as a participant. Whereas in this case, you're winding in amongst it all. So it's still very new, but it's in this lovely kind of youthful honeymoon period. I mean, it's incredibly impacting, isn't it? In even this early, in its very first spring, those repeated clouds of Lythrum particularly are really legible even this early on. But of course what we're missing are those kind of taller things that take some time to establish. Now it isn't the height, height is not slow to develop, but a whole lot of plants that you're using for height, such as maybe Stipa gigantea, or maybe some of the taller miscanthuses, or even the taller Millennias, can take some time to build up to that height. That's all, that they're not necessarily going to show in their first season. And there are other places like, right here, there's a patch of Iris sibirica that is clearly planted with the intention of it one day filling in, but is mostly at this point just bare mulch. But there's very few sections like that, actually. But the site is so beautiful, and with the light behind coming through, so you get that beautiful sense of layered transparency. This is a massive leap forward compared to what had been here, and largely because of the configuration of the beds and the intimacy and the interaction and the immersiveness that this kind of path system allows running through this kind of planting. Really interesting to see the different styles, I guess, that Pete at both ends of the spectrum, Pete Oudolf at both ends of his spectrum of planting, of blockiness on the one hand and interplanting and interspersion on the other. And so this bed behind me has got some sort of chunks, very legible chunks of Helenium, but then these lovely verticals of the Lysimachia and the Sanguisorba over there. But you know, quite soft edge. There's some Spirobolus in there, as well as this Eryngium. Things are really jostling around the edges with each other. There's a lot of interfacing, you know, and intermingling around the edges. Whereas there are other whole sections where there are just blocks of asters just swimming in a sea of other foliages. Now that's going to change over time, but it is actually kind of legitimate, legitimate ends of a spectrum with the planting. And look, very often that's driven by maintenance. As a designer myself, if I know the maintenance is not confident or particularly competent, I'm much more likely to do a block type planting, because you can say, right, all of these plants get cut down, this whole chunk of sedum, and everywhere you see this particular plant, that gets cut down in spring. Whereas if you've got interspersion, you might have to say to people, intermingling, you might have to say to people that you cut that down now, but don't cut that yet, and it gets trickier. So sometimes it's driven by that, but mostly really it's just a visual choice, and both very valid. When you're planting on a really big scale, it makes sense to go a bit blockier because things need to be legible from a distance. And as I look up the slope from where I'm standing here, you see these blocks of Lythrum, particularly of Lythrum and some Aster, just starting to emerge. Now, if those blocks weren't as big as they are, this thing could just kind of turn to a visual mush. So it's really important to have the block size that are in relation to and proportional to the scale of the planting and the distance from which you're going to see them. So that also can influence the kind of intermingling versus block planting. But both are executed here and both executed very well. My preference is for intermingling, I must say, but both work well here. It's really nice, just as a little side issue, you know, in amongst all this kind of largely pastel toned floral and seed head color. So it's the overall effect is of the kind of mauve, floaty, billowy, soft forms of the Lythrum with a little bit of gold cloud from the Deschampsia grass seed head. But just here and there are these amazing base notes of a lobelia, this really, really deep purple in colors that I can't say I've commonly seen in much of the Oudolf planting, but it is amazing how it kind of sets this really beautiful base tone and broadens the whole spectrum of the planting. But look, I could stay here all day and talk about this. There is so much to learn through a close-up look at this kind of planting this early on in its growth. There's so much to learn, not only about the planting design, but about management and about the way you need to be planting with the future in mind. In some cases, there are plants surrounding young plants that are eventually clearly going to shade out entirely the thing that's filling the space now. So there's planning for the future. There's that kind of redundancy, I guess, built in with the idea that this thing is going to be overshadowed slowly by something nearby. So there's a lot of planning of that kind of thing. And there are other places where I'm left with real questions about what's going to happen here in the future. But it's just thrilling to be here and to see something so recent and experiencing that really sweet stage of vivacity of vivacity and youthfulness, and we're right at the peak of that now.